Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, the ILO's webinar on the role of social partners during the COVID crisis and beyond. My name's Tom Hadley, so greetings to you all from a rainy London town. I've been working as a consultant with the ILO and actually helped to write one of the reports that we'll be discussing today. So it's a real pleasure to chair today's event. One thing that working on the report left me with is that the pandemic, in my view, has definitely acted as a reminder of the key role that representative bodies play. And that includes the services that representative bodies provide to their constituents, but also in terms of the ability to convene a strong collective voice and influence the big topics of today. So we've got two fantastic speakers with us today. So Maria Helena will be providing the perspective of the worker organizations, and Deborah will be focusing on the employer side of things. And I guess we've got three aims in the next hour. So one is to get a flavor of the two reports, and we're expecting massive downloads afterwards this, so let's hope so anyway. So just to give a flavor of the two reports. I guess the second aim is to really take stock and the role of social partners, the role that they're currently playing and have played during the pandemic. And I guess the third aim is that looking ahead. So what are the emerging priorities where we can make an impact? What will be some of the legacies of the crisis going forward? So that's three aims that we've got in the next hour. And just to conclude the intro, just a word on the format. So again, we've only got an hour, but we are looking for you guys to give us feedback. Do ask some questions. We'll come to as many questions as we can over the course of the hour, but comments, examples, all of those things are really important for us going forward, because one thing that is true is reports like the two we'll be talking about today are not ends in themselves, are they? They're platforms upon which we can build further activities. And again, your input will help us with that. So that's just a bit of a scene set from myself. We've got about 3 or 4 specific questions, and we'll pause after each one to see if there's any feedback from people listening to the session. So do drop us a line in the Q&A box as we go through. That would be fantastic. And let's start by going over to Maria Helena, and we'll start with you. And we're, by way of introduction, maybe give us a flavor for some of the key messages in your report. So 5 minutes each, but let's start with Maria Helena before we come over to Deborah. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, and a big word of thanks for having accepted to be our moderator this afternoon. And also my thanks to Deborah for having accepted to do this presentation together. This is, in my view, a very important signal about the role of the social partners, I would say at this stage, in moving forward in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the answers that we need to put in place. Well, I think we're all living challenging times. There's no need to repeat this. But what I would like to say and concentrate on is on the fact that workers' organizations across the globe have made unprecedented efforts in relation to this COVID-19 pandemic. I think, first of all, they've tried to influence policy responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Second, they have provided support to their members and to the persons in need. Third, they have developed strategies in order to help containing the virus and working towards reducing the negative impact of the pandemic. So the global trend analysis on the role of trade unions in times of COVID-19 that we are sharing with you today has different aims. First of all, we want to promote a better understanding of the role of trade unions. Also, we want to facilitate the exchange of experiences, of relevant information among workers' organizations. We want to strengthen the capacity of workers' organizations in influencing national policy making, and also to develop a longer-term strategy to multiply their impact at the national and the international level. Now, the findings are based on trade union responses to our survey, and the survey aimed at capturing the involvement of trade unions in COVID-19 responses We're covering 133 countries and 1 territory, and this was done between March and August 2020. We will continue looking at these examples, but so far we are presenting you the results from March to August 2020, and a big word of thanks to all those from the national sectoral trade union organizations that have brought the information to us, and also my colleagues in ACTRAV that have put together all this wealth of information. So I will not be making an exhaustive presentation of the analysis. I want to download it and to read it. That's the objective of this session. And I just want to pinpoint 1 or 2 points that in my view were very important in this work. I mean, we all know by now what are the sectors that were hit most severely, and that the slim signs of recovery that we are seeing in some sectors by no means indicate that there is a recovery for the majority of the workers and the majority of the enterprises. And the crisis has made us painfully aware, I would say, that some groups of workers and some types of companies have suffered more than others, and that this has led to an acceleration of what was already becoming an increasingly unequal world of work. So I will focus in the light of these overarching challenges on our main governance structures and the capacity of social partners to combat the negative impact of COVID-19. And I would concentrate on 2 specific highlights. The first one is the role of effective social dialogue and cooperation between governments, employers, and workers' organizations. The second one is on the role of trade union organizations in defending their members. And I think that both have proven to be indispensable for designing and implementing appropriate strategies and policies to address the negative impact of COVID-19 crisis and to try and build more inclusive societies. And first of all, let's look at those places where effective social dialogue functioned. And this was not, unfortunately, everywhere. But what we have seen in our global trends analysis is that a collective approach in comparison to an individual approach is a win-win situation for workers, employers, and governments. I would like to pinpoint that workers' organizations acted as active players in social dialogue in 108 out of the 133 countries that we have covered in our analysis, and that social dialogue was used in response to the pandemic to achieve a consensus on targeted measures to protect workers and enterprises. And we could observe that at least 1 form of social dialogue was used, sometimes bipartite social dialogue, other times tripartite social dialogue, or both. And this is a very interesting signal of how this was used in the course of the pandemic. I would say tripartite dialogue between governments, trade unions, and employers took place in 74 of the countries, and this constitutes 59% of the 133 countries. Bipartite dialogue between workers and between employers and trade unions was reported in 82 out of the 133 countries. That is 62%. And I would like to insist on this one because it is important to note that employers and workers often expressed similar concerns over the adequacy of the measures that were adopted, but also sometimes about the lack of necessary supplies on the market, for example. And in some countries, they have submitted joint statements, they have submitted joint proposals or requests to governments, and they've also implemented enhanced occupational safety and health measures or provided additional benefits to specific categories of workers. This was very important in going forward on this crisis. And so what we have seen was the social partners signing memoranda of understanding or collective bargaining agreements committing to the prevention of collective dismissals and the strengthening of employment guarantees. And this is, from my point of view, a big lesson that we need to take forward when we move in relation to the medium and longer term solutions to the impact of the pandemic. And on this, I would like to say that a participative model of relations between the tripartite constituents or of industrial relations between workers and employers working jointly to tackle the negative consequences has been very successful in implementing what was needed in many countries, sound fiscal policies and monetary policies that also help to cushion the impact of the pandemic for workers and enterprises. Let me just quickly, and I see Tom is getting nervous all the time. Let me just quickly move to the second highlight, which concerns the role of trade unions in defending their members. And what I would like to say is that besides having an active role in the bipartite or tripartite social dialogue, trade unions have provided a tremendous support to their members and to the labor force in general through what I would call targeted actions. And here we could see a panoply of things that trade unions have done. They set up emergency funds, they did awareness raising campaigns, they did training programs, they did labor market matching services, they provided legal advice, distribution of food parcels or personal protection equipment, and they've also called in some countries for the recognition of COVID-19 as an employment injury. So I think that the variety of actions that unions have provided to their members has really shown their commitment to be active, to make a difference, not just to their members, but also to workers in general and to their families and the population at large. And one point which is important to bring out in the open is that they have used significant financial and human resources to assist the members, sometimes in coping with the consequences of reduction of working hours, job and income losses, worsening of working conditions, and in some conditions, and we know that this is true, abuses from some less qualified employers. And I think that while it was difficult for unions to play one of their important roles during the pandemic, which is organizing, I think that they have made their relevance very clear and they have joined forces and managed to stay an important voice of the workers' needs. Now, was this done without consequences? No, and that's the last point I would like to quickly address, because the pandemic has had a tremendous toll on trade union governance and also on unionization. And I don't think we have seen it all. I think that this year will probably be more difficult in terms of higher numbers of unemployment and the impact that that has on trade union membership. But I think while we saw some unions looking at the fact that workers had less income, so they reduced or they just discontinued the collection of membership dues, others also saw an opportunity in this crisis in order to raise awareness and to reaching out to those workers that normally are not part of the trade union members and the trade union family. And we have seen some successful campaigns in some parts of the world. So the point here is when people work together, when workers, employers, governments are able to work together, I think you can achieve a much more concerted response to the crisis. And I think a response that has helped in mitigating the impact of COVID-19. Not everything was a love story. Not everything was a love story. We saw in some countries that there was very little use or no use of social dialogue institutions. We saw in some places violations of trade union rights increasing. But I think that in building forward together, we need to concentrate on the positive aspects, on the gains, while not ignoring the negative part of it, and to have a proactive collective agenda in moving forward is, in my view, very, very important. And that's what our global trends analysis is signaling to us. Thank you very much, Tom.
Great, thank you very much. And certainly that theme of collaboration and cooperation at a time of crisis is something that came out loud and clear in a lot of the work certainly that I saw. As we go through, and I'll hand over to Deborah to give a flavour for the ACTEMP report now, but as we go through, it was great to hear some really practical examples already from yourself. And if you've got things to share, if you're listening to this and you've got examples where you think there's concrete, almost mini case studies you're happy to share, do drop us a line in the Q&A or in the chat box. So Deborah, over to you. What's some of the core messages you'd like to get across from the ACTEMP report?
Yeah, I'm going to go very briefly, if I can, Tom, to maybe
Sure.
back in more substance in the next question. But firstly, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks ever so much for joining us. And Helena and Tom, thanks for contributing in this as our first go at doing something like this. And I hope it's not the last. Just to give you a little bit of the background of the report, because it was something we thought long and hard about doing. it started as a data collection exercise, as Maria Helena has just gone over, where colleagues in the field from the Bureau were asking employers and business management organizations what they were doing to face up to both of the health and safety, sanitary, business continuity, advocacy challenges of the pandemic and I was going to say the environment we were living through, but it's unfortunately still the environment we're still living through. And it seemed to us there was too much of a story there for it to go unnoticed against a backdrop where I think, quite frankly, sometimes it's become fashionable to deride the role of collective organizations, be they of business or workers, by the way, as something that's old-fashioned, that doesn't deliver results, is no longer relevant today's fast-moving, globalized world. So the report and the purpose of the report really was to give a backdrop to that unspoken paragraph that I've just met. But really, from our perspective, being able to tell the story of what we are seeing is really the power of business representative organizations acting as conveners of all forms of business, from the local entrepreneur to the large corporation, from the local man bashing metal under the arches, as my ex-boss used to say, to the global entity, and how organizations at collective level can bring all of that together as a convening force, but also drive and shape action for the benefit of all. And that's really what we saw coming through. So the report is split into 3 parts, and I'm going to come back to the substance probably when we come back to, the role of the social partners, Tom and colleagues, but really taking stock. So an awful lot of information in there about just how organizations representing business around the world responded to the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, how they're stepping up themselves at this challenging time. So, the services that they put in place for their members, their role in conveying the views of business to governments, trade unions, the partnerships, the new alliances they were engaging in, and the transition, I think, also of the perception of their role in society, which I think is an interesting thing that we no doubt will come back together. So that's the first part. The second was looking, and we've captioned it, taking a lead. And I think that's interesting because business organizations themselves have also not remained unaffected in their operations by the crisis. So they've had to have a look at their own relevance. Are they really performing on behalf of the members they represent? Are they doing the right kind of service mix? Are they having impact at national, international level on behalf of the companies they represent? And what are they seeing as the emerging social economic priorities going forward? And how are they changing their advocacy strategies as a result of some of those challenges that are there? And then the final part, because we're not operating in a vacuum, or we're not sort of unaffected onlookers, if I can put it like that, to take action. So what are some of the very concrete actions that they're taking for resilience in their own organizations, but also in terms of them being actors in local and national economies? And how can they build, not only within their own operations, but also in a national dialogue, a platform for recovery? How can they scale up some of their existing initiatives to make them slightly more helpful as we move towards rebooting national economies, the issue of enterprise survival and recovery? And how can they learn some of the lessons from the pandemic to lay the foundations for our future challenges of, I hate the phrase, but I'll say it, building back better? So it's an external and an internal look at the business of representing business, Tom.
Great, fantastic. And let's perhaps build on that. And I think both of you mentioned obviously the theme today is the role of social partners. And perhaps let's stay with you, Deborah, and perhaps to bring that to life in terms of examples of how business organizations have responded. Perhaps a few examples of that, and then Maria Helena will come over to you as well. So the role of, so let's start in the present and what we've seen happening on the ground would be great.
Okay, that would be great. I think it's quite interesting, and I'm going to apologize. Well, I'm not. I'm going to say straight away, I'm not name checking individual organizations. You need to read the report to see that. But I'd like to distill it perhaps into 4 key areas, if I may. One, and I think it's the most important thing, because business representative organisations are worth nothing unless they're giving the right type of support to their member enterprises. Otherwise, they're out of business themselves. And I think one thing's clear, organisations have really demonstrated absolute member centricity at this time of extreme crisis. The priority was clear: provide practical support and provide it fast. You know, we can't spend 3 months trying to respond to a member query. So, you know, from the internal issues of guidance on managing the pandemic in the workplace, guidance on return to work, guidance on support packages to governments and membership advocacy to governments about support for businesses, and some of the schemes about employment retention and things like that, against a background that's challenging for organisations. You know, if business is struggling, then they're not going to have the spare disposable income, if I can put it like that, to pay to organisations to represent them. So interesting innovation on new additional services, looking at reductions of member fees, looking at how they adapt their service provision, looking at how they can tap into something that was already happening, but the pandemic has really accelerated, the whole notion of virtual advisory, legal and consulting services. How do you move training online? How do you communicate with your members in a different way? So virtual meetings, member engagement and data collection, looking at remote working, open webinars, video briefings and podcasts. All of those things went under that heading of member centricity. I mentioned before also the harnessing a collective voice, not just on behalf of business, but also looking at how organisations reached out across the business community, firstly, to ensure that there were coherent and consistent business voices going into opinion formers and decision makers on the stages of the pandemic, be it survival, you know, what do we need to do now as we headed into the pandemic? What do we need to do through what we thought at that point was going to be the stabilization phase, you know, safe return to work for places? What are the OSH issues? And then recovery, you know, how do we reboot national economy? How do we look at jobs? How do we look at some of the solutions as to what's going to happen when the business failures really start to kick in, when a lot of the business support schemes go to an end, and they will have to at some point, that's clear. But also within that partnership angle, not only just looking at the relationship across the business community, but also, you know, the voice of business then reaches out either into social dialogue. How do we create better alliances with trade unions? How do we look to society as a whole in terms of the role of business and its views in that? And I think if there's one thing, the issue of analysis, research and thought leadership has become even more important than perhaps it was before. And the ability, and I talked about this whole economy approach before, the ability for organizations to tap into what their real members were thinking quickly at short notice meant that they were actually quite useful conduits of information for governments faced with having to put in place some of the supporting provisions around business resilience and survival that we've seen. So a leadership role, I think. And then, you know, I mentioned it before, I'm not sure, we'll have to see as we move on and see whether in a year's time we're still saying the same things. But we've termed it in the report a new era of collaboration. You know, how has cooperation with workers' organisations gone through during the crisis? It's true that in some instances, there has been a catalyst for working together to provide solutions to government. And I think that, you know, might have been on things like access to PPE, remote working, and dialogue very much became key in those ways. As I said, let's see whether that moves forward and is part of a new environment moving forward. But it's true, it was there. So a lot of the drivers of change that were already there, that were meaning that these organizations were adapting to a new environment. You know, we saw in 6 months things that we'd probably been talking about for the last decade, and things happened quickly and overnight.
Yeah, fantastic, and some really good examples there. And there's a real practical question that's come through that I'll let you reflect on, Deborah, which is about, I'll read it out, how employer and work organizations in developing economies going to survive post-pandemic when members can't pay their dues. So maybe have a little think about that. That's a really good practical question, because I think you mentioned it. You, as a membership body, you live and die on people paying you your revenue. If not, you haven't got a business, you haven't got a business organization or a work organization for that matter. So we'll perhaps come to that question afterwards. But Maria Helena, it'd be great to get your views on that role of social partners, and perhaps you mentioned it before, but perhaps some examples of where trade unions are really impacted at the current time.
Well, since I've taken much longer than Deborah in my initial comments, and I've touched upon some of those points already, I would say that I would probably be a bit more concise at this stage. I think one of the lessons we can take out of this few months that we have analyzed in terms of the pandemic was the capacity that trade unions had to really find what was the best answer and the best mechanism to be used in relation to the different challenges that they were confronted with. And I would say that at the start, it was the capacity to stay tuned to their members, very, very important. And we cannot forget that the world went on lockdowns. We all went on teleworking. Our capacity to use the traditional means of communication, the face-to-face, the meetings, it's gone. It was not there. So you had to reinvent your capacity to be attentive to what were the challenges, listening to your members in order to understand what were their concerns. I still recall at the start of the pandemic, the whole debate around the personal protection equipment, for instance, that frontline workers were confronted with, or the fact that we were seeing a lot of economic sectors being completely shut down, and what that meant, not just for the workers, but also for the enterprises in that regard. So there was a lot of analysis on the part of the trade unions, but very quickly in coming with responses and coming with proposals that were negotiated and discussed at different fora. And that's what I find was interesting. There was not just one pick and choose area. They've had the capacity, just like employers' organizations, to use all the institution, and I would say sometimes less institutional means to try and solve the issues. For me, that was very, very important in terms of what we saw. So it was about what you give to workers that are on the front line. What are their concerns? What are their working conditions? What are their wages? Because those are things that we would not, we would discuss in the past, but not such in an acute manner that has been exposed in such a clear manner, where we saw that the decent work gaps in many of those sectors that are so important, as we have seen they are for our lives, for our survival in this concrete case, would need to have a fresher look into. And I think that capacity was very, very important. And the use, as I've said, bipartite dialogue, collective bargaining, tripartite dialogue, bilateral relations with governments, and also trying to be constructive and bring solutions to the immediate problems, but also being very vigilant where you saw abuses. And as I have said, there were abuses in terms of violation of workers' rights, in terms of working time, for instance, in terms of wages, in terms of workers' protections. And there were, of course, in some countries, some governments that were not so open to consider that social dialogue was the right way to move forward. And that's why I said we need to build on these positive experiences and not to think, oh, this was done because we had a pandemic and we had an emergency. The challenge now is to say, let's continue using all these instruments we have, knowing that we don't agree on everything, and that's good. I don't say that's a disaster, but what can we construct together in order to really answer to the needs of everyone? We need the economy back on foot. If we do not have the economy back on foot, we will not have the capacity to have jobs for the workers. And I think that our biggest challenge in this second year will be what's going to happen with unemployment? What are we going to do in terms of jobs? I think, in my view, is the big challenge that we're confronted with.
Which is the next question, actually. So that's a nice segue. But could I get your views on that question that was asked, which is a very practical one? So if people are struggling, they've got less money, businesses are struggling, they've got less resources. What does that mean for people being able to pay their dues, their membership? So are you seeing trade unions having to adapt their pay structures? How's that working? So that's a really interesting and very practical question. And Deborah, I'll ask the same question to you in a minute.
I would say that we have already seen some trade unions, as I've said, suspending the collection of dues from their members because they understood that they could not put an added strain to people that were either losing their jobs or getting less pay in terms of, layoffs and all the rest. So that was one thing which we saw as a practical solution. Now, this is going to have a practical impact on the capacity of trade unions to assist their members. That will oblige them also to be much more selective in terms of the type of services that they will be able to provide to their members. And I think that's going to be the challenge that unions, workers' organizations will be confronted with, staying relevant, staying the voice, but staying relevant and the voice on those issues that matter immediately. And then you also need to start constructing the medium and the longer term. But those two timings, which need to be run in parallel, will require also on the part of workers' organizations a new form of developing trade union capacity in organizing. And I would say if there is one word that comes out in such a strong manner out of this pandemic and the lessons we learn, is that you need to be the voice of everyone in the labor market. And everyone in the labor market does not mean you have to have a job. Does not mean that you need to have a formal job. Does not mean that you're not in transition. It means that you have to be the voice of everyone. And for me, that's the challenge of workers' organizations in the near future.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting challenge. And Deborah, before we move on to the employment question, have you got any views on that question that was asked about, in practical terms, how a business organization is going to play it when businesses are struggling for resources? What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah. I hesitate to say this because we've not merged as two departments yet, but I refer you to the previous speaker, as they would say in the UK House of Lords. But no, seriously. When we surveyed with the International Organization of Employers last June, I think it was, so probably very early in the pandemic, we already saw then that I think it was 60% of the organizations that we're working with globally were looking at different strategies to incentivize members to remain in membership despite the financial strains, on their own organizations, that look at, membership fee holidays or the provision of certain services on a not fee paying basis, or temporary reduction of membership fees, or payment holidays or staggering payments. That cannot carry on ad infinitum for many reasons. But I think, one of the things that we are being told by people who are down there in the trenches facing this every day is there's no silver bullet. And if I had it, I would have it out there with the organizations we're working with every day. But I think relevance, being able to speak to business and on behalf of business, and I said before, looking at a way of ensuring that their renovation of the service delivery that really meets what their member enterprises are looking for, being able really to provide a whole business approach and a viewpoint in terms of proper policy advocacy and leadership of the business community. I don't think we can underestimate that there will be changes. There will be some organizations that struggle and let's say may go out of business. But one thing I would say is that one of the things we're seeing is the sort of divide and rule of the business voice, where you have a number of competing organizations at even sectoral, local or national level that permits a divide and rule, if I can put it like that, of sometimes governments, but also isn't responding to business need, may have to be looked at. But I think, organizations like their members are going to go through an environment where, it's going to be tighten the belt time. But as I said, a paradox where their services and their voice is needed more than ever.
Yeah, spot on. And thanks for that question, because that was very practical. Some really good insight coming from Bangladesh. So do keep giving us your examples, actually. That's really, really helpful. So let's move on to the second question. Let's swing that camera round again, Maria Helena. Let's talk about the employment agenda. We've looked in about what we're doing in terms of social partners. Let's look outwards now at the external environment and the challenge that we all face. And you mentioned it right at the start is the looming unemployment challenge. What sort of would you see as some of the immediate and sort of longer term priorities on the jobs front?
Let me refer to the ILO monitors that we have been publishing, I would say almost ever since the start of the pandemic. And over the past year, I think that they are very good instruments to give us a clear idea about the impact of the pandemic on workers and on employers. And it has highlighted the unprecedented fall we have seen in the economic activity and unemployment around the world. And I think that we need to recognize that this is just the start of the crisis. I mean, the pandemic is still with us, and now we see that it will remain with us with a great part of the current year. And I think that when analyzing all the data that we have with us today, I think that it has confirmed our main concerns that the crisis is affecting the most vulnerable groups of workers and the most vulnerable groups of employers in an exponential manner. We see that small and medium-sized enterprises that employ in many countries the majority of workers in sectors that are the most affected by the pandemic. I mean, let me just mention retail or manufacturing or hospitality. And in many cases, these sectors are also having a big part of informality in the way that they are organized. And what we have seen is that both the workers and the enterprises in many of these sectors did not have access to many of the relief programs that the governments have put in place. And this is creating added burden to the workers and to the companies. I think, let me single out very quickly two groups I find will be most hit by unemployment and that will have more difficulties in bouncing back after this crisis. I mean, we know migrant workers have a problem, but women and young people, and especially those in the informal economy, are probably those that have precarious employment relationships are probably those that are most affected. I mean, women, we have seen that there is a greater drop in employment by 5% compared to the drop of 3.8 for men employment. And what worries me is the fact that this is not just putting women back into unemployment, but it is probably destroying many of the gains we had over the last 20 to 30 years in terms of gender equality. And I don't see how we are going to put this back on track in the very near future. So one big source of concern. Second big source of concern, young people. We saw as well that the larger drop in unemployment was by 8.7%, and many of them are precariously employed. Many of them are overrepresented in the informal economy, and many of them have also suffered from school lockdowns or closures. So if we bring this together with the general lack of decent employment opportunities in many countries, I think that the impact on employment and on income levels will probably remain with us for generations and years to come. And I think we have to be collectively, again, concerned about this. I think that we cannot put up with a lockdown generation, as some of them already call it. I think we cannot, for our own collective good, be inactive, looking at the loss of talents and people being left on the sides and on the road in moving forward. So again, I come to the need for this collective agenda in helping people do their transitions, both workers and enterprises, in a way that has got to be inclusive, that has got to be fair, that has got to be in full respect of the decent work principles. And I think that while even our monitor, last one, says that the economic activity may eventually recover over the next years, as will labor markets. I mean, that we know. But if we don't act now, if we do not act together in protecting those workers and those enterprises that are the most vulnerable, then we run the risk that on the longer term, the consequences for a majority of the population will remain very severe and long lasting. So these are, again, areas for collective action from my point of view.
And I think that's a great point. The last one, I think a lot of social partners currently in many countries are working with governments to make sure that some of the support that's there for workers and businesses is not cut, in a very drastic way, that there's like a sort of phased approach to it. And I think that's absolutely right. Deborah, your views on that, on the employment challenge?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I just want to pick up where you left off, Tom, if I may, because I think, before we even get to the employment challenge, if you were to look at certainly the speeches of all of the CEOs or the presidents of the business representative organizations we work with, they would pull the debate one step back, I think, and say, many sectors remain in survival mode, if we're being optimistic, on life support, or they're in terminal phase. And that means that the key priority for a number of the organizations we're working with at the moment is helping their members weather that storm. Because if they don't exist, we're not going to be in an environment where we can talk about quality jobs or upskilling or recovery, because there'll be nothing to recover with. So I think that the key messaging that you'll see from many EBMOs at the moment is that, to a certain extent, some enterprises need more support than ever. And it's true, at the beginning of the outset of the crisis, we saw some of the financial packages, wage subsidies and credit schemes that were available. But it's clear that need is ongoing, some in particular sectors that have been disproportionately affected, and where the crisis and the impact of it is probably going to be much longer than we originally thought. I mean, we all thought we were going to be back on planes by now, didn't we? And so, point one, I think looking ahead, the recovery of national economies and labour markets has to really have a long, hard look about how we create an environment in which existing businesses can go from this life support survival mode into flourishing and creating new jobs. And that is key. Otherwise, we are going to have this brutal stop when some of the support packages that have already begun to decrease in some countries, and that's where we will see the jobs crisis and the societal crisis. And I think, some of the things where, Helena, you've just raised, I think that intensifies the policy challenges within that environment. So looking within the jobs and the business survival context, looking at the whole issue of how do we look at skills? What are the skills for the future workforce and the future economy? How do we enhance productivity growth? Looking, and Helena, you've mentioned it, but it's coming up very much from the organizations we're working with too, this notion of, the lost generation or youth employment that we were already talking about 2 years ago. It's not a new thing. The whole equality and inclusion agenda, looking at new working patterns, looking at new approaches to worker well-being. So there is also, to go back to the question we were just having about the value added and the relevance of collective organizations, there is an opportunity there to take a proactive approach to develop the new solutions to these, I was going to say emerging challenges, but they were there already. They've just been accelerated and become even more to the fore and even more important for us to attack and to work on them now. But as I said, it all begins with the right environment for employers to drive change, survival, and job creation.
Yeah, spot on. Thanks for that, Deborah. And again, a few comments in the box here around informal economy. You mentioned transitions, and I think that's definitely one area to focus on, is transitioning from informal to formal economy. So thanks for those points. We're coming to our last question, and then at the end we'll come to any other themes that people want to raise. So do put things in the box, comments, questions. And again, if we haven't got time to come to them, it really does help as we move forward. So do keep giving us your feedback and insight. That's been really fantastic so far. We've really focused on the here and now and immediate priorities. I thought the last question that we consider is the looking ahead one. And Maria Helena, it would be great to get your views on that to start with. So looking ahead at some of the priorities, for your organizations, and perhaps some of the legacies of the crisis you think are going to be front of mind in the coming months and years ahead. So that kind of looking ahead part would be great to get your views on.
I'm looking at the clock. I'll be as brief as I can, which is not always very easy. I would
like
like
to say.
I would like to say that from my point of view, there are at least 4 conditions that need to be met in order to building forward. The first one is access to vaccines. I think that to look ahead with a certain degree of optimism and to build forward better together is, for me, to ensure the democratic access to vaccines that are being developed and that they are globally distributed, allowing that those who want to be vaccinated. I mean, for me, this is not something that needs to be within the hands of the health ministers or of the prime ministers. From a labor market perspective, it is fundamental that this principle is acted upon. I would say that my second condition is that for the ILO constituents, so the governments, the employers, the workers' organizations, to look at this crisis as what I would call a wake-up call. A wake-up call on the need to build forward together, collectively and not individually, and to advance on those issues which we've been talking about already this afternoon: jobs, the labor and the social agendas, and how we continue building a context of sustainable development. Our environmental challenges have not changed. They're there. So we need still to continue moving towards this sustainable development agenda. And I would say that building political will together is fundamental in moving forward. Easier said than done. So again, this is also a very huge challenge. I also consider that alongside with political will, we need to promote greater solidarity. And what I mean by greater solidarity is that we need to look at the fact that this crisis has hit everyone, but it has not affected everyone in the same manner. And I think that it is urgent to look at the low and the middle income countries further and to see how we can use the frameworks that we already have. I mean, the 2030 agenda, for instance, in terms of helping the capacity of the multilateral system to put the solutions in place to respond to the crisis. Otherwise, our decade of action will again be a lost decade alongside with a lost generation. We have the ILO instruments. We have the ILO Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work. We have the ILO COVID-19 framework, policy framework. I think we have the basis to work towards a sound recovery, which needs to focus on the immediate answers, the medium and the longer term measures. Third one, the role of trade union organizations. I've touched upon this before. I think, again, as I said, that this is for the tripartite constituents. It is also for trade union organizations a wake-up call. And it is a clear wake-up call, which would require what I would say is a sense of urgency in relation to what were already the challenges identified in the past. We need to add to the past challenges the present and the future challenges. And I think that workers' organizations, just like employers, will have to strengthen their representative legitimacy. And this is going to be in terms of how can you innovate in your organizing techniques? How can you promote a democratic use of the digital technology? How do you reach out to those that are not the traditional formal economy members, but are the most vulnerable in our societies? And we've talked about the informal economy. We can add the rural economy. We can add the platform workers. We can add, and I think we will have to add the massive numbers of unemployed and underemployed that will be happening in this second year of the pandemic. So I think the union's agenda to build resilience and to empower in the context of the COVID-19 strategy is something that we need to look at very, very carefully. And I'm positive because what I've seen in terms of the reply to the crisis shows that there is the will to move forward in that area. Fourth condition, last one, is that we need to strengthen social dialogue, but meaningful social dialogue that leads to solutions. We often see ticking the box in social dialogue. Oh yeah, we've done it. We have done that meeting, but there are no consequences in that regard. So sound social dialogue with qualitative results, with the capacity to listen to what the social partners have got to say, the capacity to find the collective solutions to problems that are also collective is, in my point of view, very, very critical. And this is not just saying that the social partners need to bring their agendas to the table. This is about governments understanding that they will not be able to move forward if they don't do that in this collective dimension and this collective perspective, because if they do not truly embrace this participatory agenda, they will run the risk of having their public opinions turning against them. And we're seeing a number of things already today in terms of how the pandemic is being dealt with. So I would say, and I would stop there, it is, in my view, very much in the hands of the tripartite constituents of the ILO to make sure that the transitions that we face in all counts of our lives will lead us to a more certain, to a more inclusive, to a more predictable, to a better normal, as the DG of the ILO has been saying from the very start of the crisis. And I think that our little role in that regard is to work with our constituents in order to assist them in finding the best ways to move forward. They know how to do it. Sometimes they need a little push.
Great, thanks for that. Some interesting questions coming up. We'll come to a few of them at the end if we can, but do keep sending comments and questions. Even if we don't come to them, we will try and respond afterwards. But there's a point here made, I think this is from Malaysia, saying with the virus mutating, things are potentially getting worse in terms of workers being laid off, which I think comes back to the point you both made about one of the urgent priorities for business organizations and for work organizations is ensuring that some of the support measures continue, because actually, you know, things in some countries are potentially getting worse, which is a really good point. A couple of other questions we'll come to at the end, but Deborah, your views on this looking ahead piece, so sort of both short and longer term priorities for you.
Yeah, I'm always wary about crystal ball gazing because I'm usually wrong. But
we're all futurologists now.
Exactly. But you know, I'll pinch your words, Tom, and then blame you. But no, on a serious note, I mean, I think, you know, we can't, to come back to your last intervention, we live in really challenging times. And I am optimistic in a way that Maria-Helena has just said, in that we have seen some great examples from business representative organizations of leadership, of innovation, of partnership. But I think we would be fooling ourselves to say that, you know, the challenges are not huge. They are. But it seems to me that you know, even just looking at the case studies and the examples that have been shared with us on a daily basis, it's shown that results are there, and that organizations who are engaging with their members, able to pass or speak truth to power, as a New Zealand colleague of mine says, are actually showing that they add value. And I think also that, you know, one thing we didn't talk about is there is also a perception of the role of business in society that is changing, and the demands on business are perhaps slightly wider than they may have been 10 or 20 years ago. And that's the subject for a whole new webinar, I think, going forward. So, you know, on one hand, disruption can sometimes drive innovation and positive change. And we've shown that. And if you don't believe me, read the report, you'll see it writ large. But I think to come back to, you know, where we started, that will only happen also if the organizations that represent business are founded on a sound basis, which is, you know, their governance structures are sound, transparent, representative, and inclusive. That the service provision to their members is relevant and accessible and based on what they want, not what we've got to sell. And that the engagement in policy-based advocacy with government or in social dialogue is based on, again, a real drilling down to the needs of your enterprise members based on data that they're giving to you, and speaking on behalf of all enterprises in the economy, not just a small club. And, as I say, far be it from me to say here's a blueprint, but I think there are some huge challenges ahead. And one is that, I think learning to live with uncertainty is something that we're all having to get used to. I don't particularly find it comfortable, but I think EBMOs have got a key pivotal role to play in helping businesses on the one hand, but also policymakers manage the sort of urgent responses to the evolving health crisis, because we are still in an evolving health crisis, and, as we said before, its impact on national economies and employment. In the middle of all that, though, it's also important to take a breath. I find sometimes in this flurry of activity and need to deliver responses now. Now and again, it will be important for organisations to take a breath, to reflect and assess the impact and legacies of the crisis. What's really keeping your members awake at night? Are you still bothering to check in with them and see, have their needs moved? Because what we're seeing is their needs of today might not be what they were yesterday, so that the environment is moving in a quicker way. I think one of the other things as well is being in an environment where you're making trade-offs. It's true, you are going, being in a representative organisation, you're pulled two ways, if you're lucky, usually more. You are having to be responsive to members' needs and delivering on what they want, but at the same time, trying to respond to evolving public policy needs that might sometimes, when you've got finite resources, you're going to have to start making trade-offs. Where are the real priorities in this? Spreading the word. I think one of the things that we've been incredibly bad at, if I can put it like that, in the business community is we're not always so good at spreading the word. What worked? Use this to reaffirm the positive role that EBMOs can play at national level. And I really do think that the opportunity is out there for EBMOs to evolve from being the voice of business to being, forgive me for the word, the soul of business. And if they have clarity of purpose, where we've seen how they've been able to evolve into a leadership role during the crisis, that can help as we move to the next stage of, beyond survival and into hopefully resilience and recovery. But a final word on the sort of the crisis being an example of, we have some very good examples where we've seen a maturity in social dialogue. We've also seen some examples where we haven't seen maturity, but that's the world we live in. But I think, where we have strong, independent and representative organisations committed to a joint purpose, it is a powerful proposition. And a government that ignores that is actually, ignoring a potential positive force for good. But I've got to end with where I begun. Otherwise, I can see that some of the EBMOs in on the call will pick up the phone afterwards. I think supporting enterprises to help people return to work is the most crucial and important immediate action that we need to be talking about. And from that, we also need to then begin the conversations around what that means in terms of future challenges, skills, diversity and productivity and everything else that Maria-Helena has mentioned. But sometimes the sort of, I hate the word, but the enabling environment gets forgotten. But that's where we do need a more mature conversation going forward.
Right, thanks for that, and some notes of real optimism there. And I think some of the points you make there, certainly the EBMOs I spoke to about looking at this role of business in society, which is a big theme, I think, going forward. And there's some definite movement there, which I think is huge. Conscious of time, so thanks so much for your interventions. I'll just finish by looking at some of the comments and questions here, and some of these will come back to you afterwards. Quite a lot around the informal economy, which we know is a shared priority. So that's interesting. Thanks for those questions and examples. Specific question around skills, actually. So we'll perhaps come back to you, but how do we really ensure that, you know, we're right in terms of where the skills are going to be? So it's like, how do we get better at preempting where the skills are going to be? So that whole reskilling agenda is massive. In fact, I think the WEF put a report out quite recently saying that the global economy could be boosted by trillions of dollars if we get reskilling right. And so there's a big focus on that. It was a big theme of the Davos discussions as well. So reskilling, I think, is definitely a shared priority. So thanks a lot for those comments and questions. Thank you so much to Deborah and Maria Helena for your input and feedback there. We do invite you to read the reports, right? You know, so do download them, have a look, and do, you know, in the last couple of seconds, just any other thoughts or comments you got, do put it in the box, because we will review what we've got in both the Q&A box and in the chat box as well. And as I said, both of these reports are not an end in themselves. They're platforms upon which we can build going forward. And I think it was very life affirming in a way to see the sort of level of cooperation that's happening and the number of joint topics. So when you look at both reports, a lot of the issues identified as priorities going forward are the same issues. So I think there's a lot for us to work on going forward. So thanks everybody for listening. We're coming right back on time here. But thanks for your questions. Thanks for your feedback. Any other comments, do send them over. But if not, we'll call this webinar close to the minute. So thanks a lot for listening, and thanks again to our two speakers. Okay, bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.